right after that.
Okay. Today we're going to start. We're in Sivin Kuf Chaf. We'll start Halacha Yudal and Tezvav together. Okay. Halacha Yudal says like this: Ein Aminu Katan Al Tevillas Keilim. If a child performs Tevillas Keilim, he tells you that he did it, so then he has no nemonis, and you can't accept his word that he did. Aval, there are mustics in Aval and Tevillah from God will have a Tevillah, but if he would do it and someone's watching him, an adult is watching him, so then we don't have to trust the child that he did it. So then the Tevillah is fine. I'm going to read both Keilim and then I'll come back to explain what's going on. And then Tezvav says, Im hitfil Keilim idea of Tichavim. If you did Tevillas Keilim with a guy, also let him feel that Tevillah works. And there are mustics in Tevillah to like a continuation of the last din, which is that he doesn't have nemonis. So you can't trust him. So, which is sort of like why the Machaber said, if you, I'm sorry, the Machaber did not say that, but so that's why a Yid has to watch him, just like he watched the Katan, that it's good. So to the Goy also. Okay, so these two dinim, I mean, they're both about who's allowed to do Tevillas Keilim. Telling that these two people are allowed to do Tevillas Keilim, but they're really connected to each other, more than just that they happen to both do about the same thing. And that is that both of them come from what's behind both of these din is that there's no din, there's no requirement that you need Kavanah when you do Tevillas Keilim. Okay, a person, you don't have to have any special thing in mind when you do it, and therefore, if the guy is going to do it or the Katan is going to do it who have no Kavanah, that's perfectly fine. In fact, the Shach says that if the Kli falls into the mikvah without anybody putting it into the mikvah, it just fell in by itself, that's also fine. Okay, there's no one has to be behind what goes on. If someone knocks it over and it falls in, if something happens, that's also perfectly fine. And so therefore, if a child does it or the guy does it, meaning people who don't have kavanah, then that's perfectly fine. Is something wrong?
Say these two halachas in different respects.
What do you mean?
The first halacha is regarding Katan, it says Ein Aminu.
Mm-hmm.
The second halacha regarding Guy, it says in Mitzvah also.
Good. I'm going to talk about that. Okay. So I'm going to get to that later on. Okay. But that is true. It is. The wording is different, and we're going to see why in a second, in a few minutes. Okay. So if you look into it, it turns out that the Gemara actually never says these things. It doesn't talk about whether a Katan and a Guy could do Tevillas Keilim. And they asked the Rashba if they could. The Rashba is talking about a Guy. That's the case he's talking about. They asked him, are you allowed to do Tevillas Keilim? Is a guy allowed to do Tevillas Keilim? So he says, he has a few truths about it. One of the short ones says, Zu Shamati. I don't know, I never heard, I have no Kabbalah about whether the guy could do Tevillah. Avanir Hadvar Shumatir. However, it should be Mutter. Okay? And the Rashba then has a longer truth about it, where he goes through a lot of the different things about it, and he says like this. He says, there are Gemaras that say that you need to have Kavanah for Tevillah. And he says, Be'ikr, those things are for special dinim. He says for kachim and truma you have to have kavanah. But everything else doesn't. All other tefillos do not have to have kavanah. And then he has a long list of things, actions that have to do with mitzvahs. I'll give you examples in a second. Actions have to do with mitzvahs, and he says a rule. He says an action that has to do with a mitzvah, a guy could do the action unless there's a special gzeres hakosib or reason why he's not allowed to. Okay, but if you listen to his examples, all the examples have exceptions. Okay, so he says the two that he's allowed to are a guy's allowed to build a sukkah and an eruv. Okay, sukkah, it's a mishnah. A sukkah is ganbach. A guy's allowed to build a sukkah and an eruv. And then he has a whole bunch of examples where he's not allowed to. And for each one of them, he says, you see, because each one of them has a special gzeres hakosov or a special reason. His examples are shchita, hafarshes truma, making matzah shmura, writing sefer Torah, and making tzitzis. And for each one of them, there's a special reason why, for each one of them, why they're not allowed to do them. But he says, be'etzim, a guy, there's no reason why a guy can't do an action that's to do with a mitzvah, like shchita. That's an action that's to do with a mitzvah. There's no reason why a guy couldn't do it, unless there's a special gzeres hakosov, a special reason in each case why they're not allowed to do it. Okay. Now, so that's what the Rashba says. And that's what's going on here in the Shulchan Aruch, that you don't need kavanah because we're fasting like that. The Trumas Hadeshin has a whole bunch of other reasons why you should let a katan do tefillah. He says because you could teach the katan, the katan could have kavanah, you could be gadol or gadol and make sure he has kavanah. Maybe you could get away with like partial kavanah. There's all kinds of reasons like that. But the Taz and the Shach say, he says the fact that the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that. He doesn't say you could have a katan do tefillah if you teach him to have kavanah. He doesn't say anything like that. from that it's meduik that the Mechaber is passing like the Rashba, which is that you do not have to have Kavanah b'chlal. There's no need to have Kavanah at all, and therefore Tevillah works without no Kavanah for a guy, for a cotton, or even, again, the shots that fell in by itself, it's perfectly fine. Okay, now, the Bach picks up on the diak that the Mechaber says in Hitva Kem Adei Av Kechavim also Lehem Tevillah. Okay, he says that works only b'diavad. Okay, when I give it notice that it sounds like it only works b'diavad. The Bach says, no, how come it says it only works b'diavad? What's wrong with doing it? What's the difference? As long as you know that he did it, what's the difference that it should only be b'diavad? The Bach says that the Rashba who said that you don't need to have kavanah is l'shitasa with a shita that he has in Hilchos Nida, and he says we don't pass like that. We don't pass like that shita, and therefore l'chatchila a guy could not do tefillah, and it's only b'diavad that a guy could do tefillah. That's what the Bach says. But everybody argues on that. The Taz says that the reason why it says over here it's only b'diavad, the reason why it says by the God also have tefillah as if it's only b'diavad, so the Taz says that's because you're going to lose out on saying the bracha. If the guy does the tefillah, you can lose out on saying the bracha. We're going to talk more about that later on. Okay, so most people say like what I said at the beginning, which is you don't have to have kavanah. The guy and the katan are perfectly fine to do the tefillah. It's just an action that has to happen. That things got to get into the water. Who does it doesn't make a difference as long as you make sure that you know that it happened, and you have to have someone who you could trust. And we'll talk about the bracha part of it in a second.
If it's something that anybody doesn't need a bracha, then according to the Taz.
Right? Correct. We're going to talk about nafkaminas like that at the end. Okay, correct. The Taz only says the only reason to say the chatchila, I'll get back there in the end, is only because of the bracha parts like that. Okay.
The trust issue is good also, right?
Right, there's a trust issue. You have to make sure it happened. That's one part of it.
Why did the Mechaber say that?
Why didn't he say what?
Because no namanis.
So I guess he figured if he said on a katan you don't trust him, you would figure that out. The Ramah stuck it in Avlain and Emal, but I guess he figured if he told you a katan you don't trust him, so you're going to get the idea yourself.
So why didn't he write that it works?
That what?
That it works by a katan.
Why doesn't he say?
That was my question originally. I wasn't focusing on that.
So he's aiming a katan because to him again. What's the underlying point here is that of course the katan can do it. I don't have to tell you that. I just don't trust him.
So why by katan does he focus on the namanis and by the
because that's the only thing
that works? That's my question. He's focusing on two different things.
Okay, so again, by the katan he's saying that he has no namanis. Okay, that's true.
We don't say that it works. And then he comes to the guy and he says that it works. We don't say he has no namanis.
I think it was not such a chiddush that a katan that it works.
Right.
But it's a big chiddush that it works.
The chiddush that it works. Is a bigger chiddush by a guy than a katan?
Yeah. Yeah, with katan we woke up in the mitzvah.
Okay, but namanis is a bigger chiddush by a katan? No,
they're equal. They're equal.
Right. He really could have said they both these offices together in one sit.
They come from different places. That's why they're in different things. But okay, fair. Okay, I'm not sure. Okay, so now let's go. I'm going to split now. First, talk about things about a katan. That's halach yudalad, and then talk things about tezvav, which is for a guy. Okay. First, I want to remind you something for those of you who've been around. The Mechaber says a katan doesn't have nemanis to say he did tefillas keilim. That's what he says. That's what he says. Ein aminu katan al tefillas keilim. That's what the Mechaber says. When we went to Peidalad, when we learned the halachas of bugs, we learned over there. I spoke the whole time about which things are katan and an isha nemanon. I don't know if you remember that. We spoke about them. And over there, there's a machlokes about this din over here. We spoke about it then. I'm going to just tell you in a second what it is, which is the Mechaber says he's not nemon. Okay, there's a machlokes in the achronim. What happens if the katan is talking about glass? Okay, what happens if he's talking about something that's only chayv and tefillas keilim with rabbanon? Is the katan having nemanos on it? Okay, and because of that, whatever the cheshbonis we spoke about it in that year, this cheshbonis that a katan should be nemen for l'chayra in svar. The katan should be nemen for the rabbanon. So if he send the katan to Tevillah glass, then the katan should have nemanos to say that he did tefillas keilim. That would be enough to a guy. The guy wouldn't have nemanos. The katan wouldn't have nemanos over there. And the Chacham says even for glass the katan has no nemanos. And the Taz and Chum says, I know what you're talking about. They're not talking about him, but they say, what are you talking about? According to the rules that we have, when a katan is neman, the katan should have nemanos for those things. And at the time, the best we could explain why the Mechaber doesn't say it. The Mechaber, how are they going to explain? The Mechaber says, Eim Aminu Katan Tfilas Keilim. Well, the reason that the Chacham Zalman brings was not so strong. We'll have to go listen to the recording of it. Then maybe the Mechaber is just being loy plug. When he says don't use it, he just don't trust the Katan. He just means there's loy plug. It wasn't clear. Okay. Now, what's wrong?
Why are we concerned that he's not going to do it properly?
I'm getting to that. Okay. I'm getting to that. Be patient. I'm going to get to that. Okay. Another thing is like this. When we say that you don't trust the Katan, at what point would we say that now he's not a Katan anymore, that we should trust him? So what I mean is like this. We know that in order to be considered a Gadol, we need to have two things. You need to have Shanim and Simanim. You have to be 13 and you have to have Shtei Cyrus. Okay? You have to have two things. So the Gemara says is, Chazaka Rava, we have a Chazaka that says is, the Chazaka that tells us that if he's Shanim, then he has Simanim. If he's 13, then he has Cyrus also. There's another Gemara that says that you do not trust that a boy who's 13 has Simanim also. We don't trust it in the cases of Kiddushin and Gerushin and Chalitza. Okay? So what's the difference? Make up your mind. Is there Chazaka or is there not Chazaka? Okay? So most of the places can go along with what Magen Avraham says. It's not so clear. Not everybody agrees to what I'm about to say. To what you all know, the Magen Avraham says it depends if it's a Deraisa or Drabanan. Okay? If it's a Deraisa, then we accept that we follow the Chazaka, and if it's a Drabanan, then we don't. If it's a Drabanan, we follow the Chazaka, and if it's a Deraisa, we don't. And those three cases happen to be three things that are Deraisa. Okay? Others argue, Yehuda says no, something special about, Prima Gordon says there's something special about those three dinim. Each one of them has a special reason why we're machmir about it. Yehuda has a different answer. When we do it, don't believe it. But Prima Gordon ends off, he says, Mavur b'poiskim, the b'chol is a Torah boy b'dika. Okay? He says, like the Magen Avraham says, which is not everybody agrees to that, but what the Magen Avraham says, that for if it's a deraisa, then you don't believe him, you don't accept the chazaka, and you have to check for the simanim. So, if I told you that, if we just stopped over here, I would say that if you want, when it says Ein Maminu Katan Al Tevillas Keilim, means is if a 13-year-old wants to do Tevillas Keilim, then it would depend. If it's a deraisa, if it's a metal kli, then you have to make sure he has simanim. And if it's a glass kli, then you trust him just because he's 13. Okay, that's what you would say if you stop right now. That's what you would say when it says Ein Maminu Katan. Actually, there are some cases when you wouldn't mamin a 14-year-old because you're not sure he's a gadol either. Okay, which I guess that's sort of built into it. Right, content. Okay, so for some things you would believe him if he was this, and not for other things. And that's in a lot of places. Every time it says content, it doesn't have to tell you those things. It's the beginning of Aruch Chaim talks all about that, so it doesn't have to keep on telling it to you every time. Okay, that's fine. Okay, now, but there's a question. Okay, this is not a question from here. There's a question. The Prima Gordon asks this question. He says, "Why taka don't we rely on the chazak even by deraisa?" He says, let's take what the Magen Avraham says. Now, the other people give explanations why certain places you don't rely on the chazaka. But the Magen Avraham says, no, it depends if it's a deraisa or drabanan. Okay? It's nothing special about the cases. It's deraisa or drabanan. He says, why not? He says, chazaka is chazaka. Why shouldn't we trust the chazaka? All over, lots of places we trust chazakas. Chazaka says that something is true, then it is what it is. Why shouldn't we be silent on chazaka when it comes to Issa deraisa? What's wrong with that? Chazaka is chazaka. I think he has examples. I don't remember them. But what's wrong with following chazaka? So Prima Gordon has two answers why we shouldn't necessarily follow chazaka. First answer is, he says, his first answer is, back to Hilchos Torah. His first answer is that Mir Hamatzi of 13-year-olds don't have simanim. And since it's a Mir Hamatzi, Midrabanan you mechuy to be choshesh for Mir Hamatzi, and therefore the Midrabanan you can't be samech on the chazaka. Midraisa there's a chazaka. Midrabanan since it's a Mir Hamatzi that won't have simanim, so Midrabanan you're mechuy to be choshesh that there was no simanim. So it's a Drabanan dikdin. And the second is he says also Drabanan dikdin, which is that when there's efshel v'ru b'kal, then you're not allowed to be samech on the chazaka. And therefore, he says, and therefore, saying that you shouldn't be samech on the chazaka would be saying that it's efshel v'ru b'kal. Okay? So he says, of these two, he says the first one is the correct one. The second answer is not correct. He says it's not considered efshel v'ru b'kal. Why? Is because if it was Efshel V'Ru B'Kal, it wouldn't work by Drabanans either. We wouldn't be Samachana to anything. If it's in the gather of Efshel, it's easy to check, then that would work every place. It would be Efshel V'Ru B'Kal, Efshel V'Ru B'Kal. It wouldn't work by Drabanans either. So he says it must be that the reason is because it's considered a Mir Hamatzui. It happens, it's common enough that someone who has Shonim doesn't have Simonim, and therefore, for the Rices, you have to be Choshesh. For the Rabbanans, it's like, we wouldn't make a Din Rabbanan to be Choshesh for Mir Hamatzui, for something that's only us with the Rabbanan in the first place. So therefore, over here, that if the Chiv Tefillah is only with the Rabbanan, we don't have to be Choshesh for the Mir Hamatzui that don't have Siman. Okay, and there's actually a thing like that, exactly in Hilchos Tolaim like that also. We're not Choshesh for Mir Hamatzui in certain cases like that. Yeah. So, well, that's a practical thing. He makes it like it's a practical thing, which is, well, I guess, like, what do you say? Yeah, use your imagination. Figure out why. So the Prima Gordon says, when he brings, when he brings the tzad, he said, well, that we would have to say it's actually because it's debatable whether it could be this way. You know what I mean? So he says no, it can't be because the rest it would be better upon us. Okay.
In theory, it could be not good on mice, and you could ask by a doctor. But my understanding is that nowadays it's not a Beit Hamatzah anymore.
Okay.
The age has gone down.
Okay. So if the reason is because of Mir Hamatzah, then Ken Zayin would change it. It wouldn't be much. Yeah. Okay. Right. So in the Matzah. Okay. So that's good with me. Okay. So you should know the Mishabura has a line about this, and the Mishabura says he says the Prima Gordon is marach about this shaila about chazaka, and he comes out that it's midrabanan that we're not samach with the rices because a mir of the children don't have simanim, and therefore we have to check. Okay, which is what the Prima Gordon says. The Prima Gordon's conclusion is that the reason is because of mir hamatzi. That's the reason for doing it. Okay. Okay. So now back to Tevillas Keilim. Okay, being Tevillah medically is midraisa. So I just told you. The Prima Gordon says this is a Prima Gordon. The Prima Gordon says that it's the Prima Gordon in Aruch says that we follow the Magen Avraham that by the right says you have to check for simanim. So you would therefore say, what should he say about Tevillas Keilim of a metal kli? It should be obvious that you should not be samach on the 13-year-old. You should need to check for simanim. In fact, that's not what the Prima Gordon says. Well, I shouldn't say it's not. It's not so clear. That's what the Prima Gordon says. Prima Gordon says. Now the Prima Gordon, this happens to be in Aruch also, but it's not in that part of Aruch. It's in Hilchos Hagol's Keilim. We've mentioned that there's like one Prima Gordon in Hilchos Hagol's Keilim, it's a very long Prima Gordon about all kinds of things, and then he says, well, in Tevillas Keilim, I'll tell you a few things. Okay, so all of his Hilchos Tevillas Keilim in like this many lines. He packed like 100 things into 5 lines. We've mentioned the same Prima Gordon a lot of times. Anyhow, so today's line is, he says, if it's glass, even the katan is believed. No question, that's what we talked about before. If it's glass, we believe the katan, no problem. He says, but if it's metal, and he's 13, he says, seemingly, you should need to check for simanim, like the tzarachim. So, you could read that how you want to. You could say he's just being, in his usual modest self. Okay, Prima Gordon is good at that, so to speak. Being more modest. Sure doesn't seem like that. When he talked about the glass, he was very clear. By glass, you can believe even the katan. There was no questions about it. Here, he seems to be not so. By glass, he says you can believe the katan. He's like, no question. He has no question. Now that's not so clear. But there's no problem. Glass, you can believe the katan. By metal, for a 13-year-old, without checking siman, he says seemingly you should have to check the siman. He's not so sure. Okay, so maybe it's a dig, maybe it's not. The question would be why? What would be the reason, according to all the rules that we know, if the katan, if he's a gadol, we know that for the rices you have to check the siman. So what should be? So if you look at the Pesach Tshuva here, Pesach Tshuva he brings that a reason why you should not need to check the siman, and he says the reason is because if you use a kli and you didn't tevel it, the food stays kosher, and therefore you shouldn't have to check for it. Okay, so it's like so medrash kli. Like, what is he talking about? So what if you use the kli? If you use the kli, the food will stay kosher. So what is that? How does that explain? How does that explain why you should trust the God? Well, I have a mitzvah to do a mitzvah deraisa to tevel the kli. Do I trust the 13-year-old that he did, or should I not trust him? Well, either yes or no. If that's a mitzvah deraisa, what do I care whether the food's going to be treif afterwards? What's the connection? Okay, so there are other answers. There are other answers for it, but I was very happy to find Rabbi Wagner Saved has a tshuva about this. Okay, that's not that surprising. And he brings from a sefer called Zecher Simcha, okay, which is was written by a person named Reb Simcha Bamberger. Okay, no idea who the person is. I have no idea who it is. And in that tshuva, this Reb Simcha Bamberger sent a shayla to Reb Yitzchak Elchanan, asking him, can you believe a 13-year-old who didn't check the siman to do Tevillas Keilim? And Reb Yitzchak Elchanan wrote him back. And in this Sefer Zeicher Simcha has the whole tshuva from Yitzchak Elchanan explaining why he thinks that you don't have to check the siman. Okay, so it was like, to me that was exciting. And I guess this whole I was going to put that up on the screen. It's a couple of paragraphs. A tshuva from Yitzchak Elchanan about why you could trust the gadol even if he didn't, even without checking for him, even for metal. And Rabbi Vadia thinks he's right. He goes along with it. It says like this. It's a two-part thought of what the reason is. The first is, he says is, you should allow it because it's a svek seker. What's a svek seker? There are those who hold that Tevillas Keilim even for metal is a derabbanan. He says, so we could be mitzaref that some people hold like that. We've talked about this with this. Some people hold like that. Maybe the Rambam holds like that. That Tevillas Keilim even for metal is a derabbanan. Well, and the second topic is maybe he has simanim. That's probably a better tzad that he has simanim. So svek seker, and it should be mutter. Svek seker should tell us that the child, the 13-year-old should be believed. Okay, so he says, but he says, but there's a chazaka against the svek seker. The chazaka tells us that the kli wasn't toivel. Okay, so he says that now comes the second point. He says the only time a chazaka says that a chazaka would win against a svek seker is when it's a cheskes iser. A plain old chazaka doesn't work that. A chazaka that says that cheskes iser does work against that. I don't know the reason, but that cheskes only if it's cheskes iser. So now we understand what the Pischei Teshuva means to say is. I think he's Maram said. I think he says that's what the Pischei Teshuva means is that since there's no iser involved, there's a mitzvah for me to do, but there's no iser for me to do. Therefore, the svek seker is the reason why you're allowed to believe it. So it's not that because the food is mutter, therefore I can believe the gadol. It's because since the food is mutter, that takes away the problem of being, so to speak, a chazaka against it. And there is a chazaka, but not a chazaka that would stop a svek seker. No, not midraisa. Not midraisa. If it's a derabbanan, we're good. We could trust it, the 13-year-old. On the deraisa level, it's just a mitzvah to do. That mitzvah doesn't stop a svek seker. Svek seker is good enough.
Sorry, this is what's troubling with the whole halacha. The feel issue is Yaakov and Mishnah Berurah. The whole halacha is not coming if you have to title it again. But the gabe the Isser Shtamshus, it's only the Rabbanon. You should be able to run a cotton even for metal.
That's true, but I have a mitzvah. I wonder if I get my mitzvah or not.
Look, so you have to title it again. But
No. So it's just the essay.
If a cotton came and said, I title this fork,
yeah.
So you can't believe him. So you have a mitzvah now to title the fork again, but you're allowed to use the fork to either.
That's true, but the question is, if I get my mitzvah, I have a mitzvah. Should I trust him? So should I trust him that I did the mitzvah? The Prima Gaon says, no, you have to do it again.
So you're going to say
Rabbi Yitzchak says, you don't have to table it again. Yeah, Rabbi Yitzchak says, don't table it again. Don't bother. Please.
If your son comes to you and he says, I tabled this fork,
right?
You're going to say, I have to table it again, and then you're going to say, Tevillah, can I use it? You're going to say yes.
No, because he's a cotton. No. He's 11.
He's like less. The government is the same
yeah, it goes together. It's hard. It's sort of like, it's nostalgia. So when I have a mitzvah on the deraisa level, I'm not trusting him. So now for the derabbanan level, I'm not going to trust him either. You can't say I'm half and half.
Maybe a little bit trustworthy.
A little trustworthy.
Yeah, and then.
What do you think? That's what he's trying to say. I don't propose it. Once the suffix is nispasha for the deraisa, from the deraisa level, I have to say I can't trust you. So for the derabbanan, okay. Anyhow, so that's what Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan says. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan says that what. And now I have to tell you this. So Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan is happy. He says, yeah, you can trust the 13-year-old, and Rabbi is okay. But I mean, the Prima Gaon, even though he's a little not so convinced, but he sure sounds pretty convinced. I mean, reading Prima Gaon, that sure sounds like he's pretty sure. And I think most people would assume like that. Like the simple reading of Magen Avraham, that when you have it the Reisa, you don't trust the Gadol unless he has his Simanos. Okay, let's move on to we have a little to say more for God. Okay, when the Mechaber said if the Hitva came a day of Gechaven, also on Tevillah. Okay, so I mentioned to you that the Bach says that it sounds like it's only B'diavad. Okay, so the Bach says that in general because this. I think a bit.
Maybe the God is a cotton. Maybe it's a cotton, then what?
Maybe it's delete because it's going to derabon. Mitzvah is going to derabon.
No, he doesn't say that.
You can't do that.
I don't.
Understand it's the cost of even derabon.
David, I don't remember if Reb Chanan speaks about that. I don't think so. He brings he has a kasha himself from a din we had beforehand. He says I have a lot to say about it, but I'm not going to tell you. So you can look at V'yesh Arichas Tvarim.
Where is the tshuva from Ravadia?
I'll give it to you if you want afterwards. Ravadia's tshuva is Chelik Zayin Siman Test, but he doesn't quote the whole thing in Yabi Chaimer. But he does not. He doesn't quote. If you want the tshuva from Reb Chanan, I'll give that to you. Okay, so the Bach says it's only for the Evid, because this idea that you could do it without Kavanah, we don't hold that l'chatchila. I mentioned that the Bach with him, which most people don't hold. Another answer, another explanation for that is, in the Chalkas Binyamin, he says a different explanation. He says if along the lines of, I don't know if he used exactly these words, mitzvah yotzim b'shluchai. What are you having to go do? You have a mitzvah. You're supposed to do Tevillas Keilim. What are you doing having to go doing your thing for you? You're supposed to do a mitzvah. So it's true, it works, but it's not what you're supposed to be doing. Okay? And the other one I mentioned to you before also is that the Taz says is that it has to do with the bracha. So the nafkamina is, as was mentioned, the Taz...
If you could use it going, then working with the shlichus.
No, so you have a mitzvah. I'm saying it's along those lines. I have a mitzvah to Tevillas Kli, and I'm avoiding the mitzvah. I'm not. You just supposed to do the mitzvah.
It's megala. The whole thing is no mitzvah on me to do it. If I have a mitzvah,
It's not true.
Exactly. Yes, of course. I was using the words loosely. I was using the words a little loosely. Okay, so the nafkamina is, as was mentioned, is what happens if I don't have to worry about the bracha. Okay, so he mentioned beforehand that I don't have to worry about the bracha. Let's have a clear that won't need a bracha. There's we had mentioned lots of cases where we do tefillah without a bracha. Okay, well the Taz says the nafkamina is let's have Tevillah 5 Keilim. Okay? One, I'm going to go along with the guy. I have to go along with the guy because he won't be trusted. So I go to the first kli, I make the bracha. Okay, now I'm only going to make one bracha anyhow. So I make a bracha on the first kli, and then I Tevillah the first one, and he Tevillah the rest of them. So we didn't lose that on the bracha. What?
Sometimes that the bracha goes on all 5. So I think in the first,
That's a good question, because the bracha does not go on his kale. That's true. I don't make a bracha for the guy. If I stood there and watched the guy, I wouldn't make a bracha on him. I wouldn't make it. So it's true. But the Taz says. But the Taz says what?
That's what you always do.
Right. But the Taz says. Rega. But the Taz says that's at Hezber as to why the Rashba says that l'chatchila you could have it, you do it. You could have a guy do it, and the Mechaber says only b'diavad. So that's one of the Bach's questions. How come if the Taz says it was l'chatchila, how come the Mechaber didn't say it? So he says that the Raj was talking about a case when you did some of the Keilim and the guy did some of them. So you made the bracha, you didn't have a problem with a bracha. The Mechaber is telling you that it works b'diavad because you would theoretically lose out on your bracha. Okay, so the Taz says if you make the bracha with the guy, no problem. No, it's not b'diavad at all. If you make Tevillah some Keilim, the guy tells us it's not a problem. And that case is very lemaisa. Okay, it's very lemaisa, not for most people, but very lemaisa for hashkafas. Okay, because when a caterer buys 1,000 pieces of silverware or 500 dishes that need to be Tevillah, okay, so they send the mashgiach to the mikvah because he has to make sure it happens. That's the mashgiach's job to make sure it happens, and the mashgiach's got to do things. But there's 1,000 pieces of silverware that have to be Tevillah, so they send help with him. Okay, he doesn't one guy do it by himself. He'd be there for a month being Tevillah the Keilim. So they send help with him. So if the people who come with him are not Goyim, the mashgiach could use the Goyim. He makes the bracha on the first ones. They start with this big stack of silver where the Yid makes the bracha and does the first ones, and then the Goyim can do the rest of it, or they do it together. They do all the rest of the Keilim. Okay, so that's exact case.
How does that work? Why is the bracha?
So he's looking at it from the side of every kli has to have a bracha set on it. That's how he's looking at it. And the Taz says, no, we don't. We'd only make one bracha here altogether. Even if I did all the Keilim, I'd only make one bracha. So the fact that one bracha was made, I didn't lose anything.
The Taz says earlier in the similar, I don't remember where, that if they have a kli without a bracha, so Tevillah to another kli.
Correct.
Why? Because the bracha goes on the other kli.
It's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is. The Taz says it over here. You say. Okay.
What's the problem?
No, over there. You have a mitzvah over there.
At the time, you have a shayla, you make a bracha.
You're not gaining anything. If I have 2 Keilim, one needs a bracha and one's a suffix.
Yeah.
and I make the bracha on one by itself, and tomorrow I come back and tell the other one. How many brachas did I make? I made one bracha. If I do it together, then you have that kid, you had a shot, you should make a bracha now. You have a bracha. Maybe you did a mitzvah without a bracha. You want to avoid that. So I did the mitzvah with the bracha.
Do the mitzvah.
I don't understand. I don't understand any.
Forget about the bracha. Yeah, do it here. I'm toiling Keilim. Yeah, I make a bracha. I have a whole stack of Keilim, and then in the middle you walk into the mikveh and say, "Oh, I'll help you."
Okay.
You don't need to make another bracha on the Keilim like you do.
I do. I'm doing the mitzvah. I'm doing the mitzvah. I'm making another bracha.
And if you wouldn't make a bracha, that means you would be doing a mitzvah without the bracha, which is the issue of the prohibition into the Malcham Shalei, right? So how does it become different when the guy is doing it? The guy is not Tevillah and Keilim.
The guy is not making a bracha.
So what's the bracha? So when going out from a yid, how can you say that a yid can't do it without the bracha, but a guy can't do it without the bracha? You'll be out of the typical
I don't think can't do it without a bracha.
What bracha would he make?
Go watch the video. Okay, guys, time out. Let me finish. I'm almost finished, and you guys can find out.
This what actually happens?
That what? That they send 100%? No. If they have 1,000 pieces to do, so they have to send the mashgiach. You have to send the mashgiach because mashgiach's got to make sure it happens, and he's over take care of it. But he sent people with him. One guy, there's a lot to do. You know? Okay. So now. But this brings up a point that was mentioned before, which is we talked about way beforehand, and we're going to talk more about it in Mirz Hashem and Simon Reish Beis, that there are lots of details to doing a Tevillas Keilim properly. Okay, and the one we talked about in the past was you can't hold the cleat too tightly. Okay, it has to all be in the water at the same time. So when we say that you could have a guy do Tevillas Keilim, I'll say this in two different ways. I'll say it the nice way. It's only going to be a work in cases where it's obvious that what he's doing is being done correctly. What I mean is, if it's a thing that's questionable, if the action itself is questionable, then how am I going to trust him? It's not a matter of fact. How am I going to know that he did it correctly? I watched him do it. But how do I really know that I actually watched him do it correctly? He stuck it into the water. Let's say he held it in his hand, and he put it into the water. How am I going to know the subtlety of whether he held it tightly or held it loosely? How do I know that? So it'll only work in situations where either it's obvious he's just throwing forks in, he's throwing forks in. Right, so it'll only work. We'll do it. It'll be cases where he's doing it really simply. If he's doing really simply, just throwing forks into the mikveh, it's really obvious that it worked. Or he did such a thing, we made his hands wet, and his hands wet, they were in the mikveh, with all kinds of pashkarai. What I'm saying is, so this din is not for everything. When we say you trust the guy, it means is you trust the guy in situations where it's obvious that what he did was correct. Okay? As opposed to when I trust my neighbor, when I trust someone in the room besides you, when I trust somebody else in the room, then I don't have to check up on them, did you do it correctly? Because that's part of his nemanas is that when a person does the mitzvah, he does it correctly. I don't have to follow up on that. Here, it's not just that did he actually get into the water, it has to be he got into the water correctly. Okay? Now, and one last thing I'll mention, the Chacham brings in, that in, we said is the guy, and for that matter the katan, have no nemanas. Okay? They don't have nemanas that they did it correctly. Okay? So he brings, like there's a din in Siman Tezayin in Yerdeh. Okay, Siman Tezayin is the Siman about Oisav Espanoi. Okay, and it says there that if people without nemanas, like a guy tell you that they shechted the mother, then there's no problem. You don't have to believe them. You ignore it, and you don't have to be chayshish that Isra. But if you trust the person, if you think that they're telling you the truth, then lahachmir, you have to believe the person. Okay, and therefore, so if you really believe the guy that he's telling you the truth, you know that you have reason. You personally think he's telling you the truth. So halachically, he has no nemanas, and lekuli you wouldn't believe him, but l'chomer you would. So in the Chacham he says this. So in Cain, if a guy tells me he did Tevillas Keilim, or a child tells me he did Tevillas Keilim, and I think that he's really telling me the truth, then when I do the Tevillas Keilim afterwards, he says you should do Tevillah without a bracha. He said, because l'chumra, you should believe the person.
Why specifically guy I think he's telling me the truth? It should create a self.
So over there it doesn't.
I think he's lying.
You see over there that that's not the way we do. They don't have the most ben l'kul ben l'chumra. But if I personally trust him, so that you can go look at Siman Tezayin. That's in the wrong Shulchan. You go look at Siman Tezayin. But it says I hear the question. You should say I should be choshesh. But it says that we don't believe them bein l'kula, bein l'chorma. We don't give them any nemanos at all. But if I trust him, if I personally, come on, I know that the guy did. Somehow I have that. I work for the guy that pays 12 years, and I know he's telling me the truth. Then l'chorma. Now it doesn't say it over here, but he says l'chorma should be this, which sounds right to me. That you should say in that case you should see without a bracha.